Let me tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. In 3 years of investigating the COVID origin story, I've found something far more disturbing than a lab leak or a wet market. What if the reason we can't prove where COVID came from isn't about evidence being destroyed? It's because China engineered the entire information environment so perfectly that proof itself became impossible. And here's the part that should terrify you. They did it in plain sight and we're still following their script. Forget everything you think you know about lab leaks and pangolins. Here's what nobody tells you. This isn't a story about a virus. It's a story about three interlocking systems of control that China has spent 20 years building. And COVID was the stress test that proved they work. Stay with me because what I'm about to show you changes how you see not just the pandemic, but everything China does on the global stage. Most people think the origin debate is about science, labs versus markets, gain-of-function research versus natural spillover. But here's what's really happening. While we've been arguing about petri dishes and horseshoe bats, we've completely missed that China has constructed something unprecedented, a triple-layer system that makes accountability functionally impossible, regardless of what actually happened in Wuhan. I'm going to walk you through these three systems. The first is what I call the opacity machine. The second is the narrative injection network. And the third, this is the one that should keep you up at night, is the institutional capture framework. By the end of this, you'll understand why we're asking the wrong questions entirely. Let's start with the opacity machine, and I need you to understand something critical. This isn't about a cover-up in the traditional sense. It's far more sophisticated. When COVID emerged in December 2019, China didn't just hide information. They created what intelligence analysts call strategic ambiguity, a fog so thick that even if evidence exists, it becomes functionally irretrievable. Here are the numbers that matter. Within the first 47 days, Chinese authorities had detained 8 doctors for spreading rumors, scrubbed the Huanan seafood market so thoroughly that international investigators found it sanitized 14 months later, and sequenced the virus genome, but waited 7 critical days before sharing it globally. But here's where it gets interesting. A senior virologist told me off the record in 2022, the genius wasn't destroying evidence, it was creating 50 competing evidence trails. Think about what we saw. Simultaneous leaks suggesting the market, suggestions about US military athletes bringing it to Wuhan, whispers about Italian sewage samples and laboratory rumors, not one narrative. This is the opacity machine at work. China State Council Information Office has 1,783 full-time employees. This is the exact number from their 2019 budget disclosure, whose entire job is managing information flow during crises. But the system goes deeper. Every research institution, every hospital, every university in China operates under pre-approval publication protocols. What this means in practice, no Chinese scientist can publish findings about emerging infectious diseases without clearance from at least 3 government bodies. Let me show you what this actually means. Dr. Li Mengyan, the virologist who fled Hong Kong, described a system where her supervisors at the WHO reference lab weren't just cautious, they had a checklist provided by Beijing for acceptable research conclusions. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is bureaucratic structure. When I was researching this in 2023, I talked to researchers who worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on joint projects before 2020. Every single one described the same thing. After November 2019, a sudden communications blackout. Not dramatic, not announced, just silence. Emails went unanswered. Collaboration portals went dark. One researcher told me it was like watching a building slowly fade from view. The opacity machine has 3 components: information control at the source, strategic narrative multiplication, and institutional sealing. We've covered the first 2. The third is where it gets truly impressive, and it connects directly to why the WHO investigation found nothing conclusive. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. China didn't block the investigation. They controlled it so precisely that investigators could only see what was already prepared. And that's just the first layer. The second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening. Let me show you how China doesn't just control information, they control the investigators themselves. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. I call it the narrative injection network, and it's not about controlling what people can't see, it's about flooding the zone with what they must see. Here's the uncomfortable truth. China has spent 2 decades building the world's most sophisticated influence operation, and COVID gave them the perfect opportunity to demonstrate its power. Most people think propaganda is about suppressing one story and pushing another. That's amateur hour. What China does is create an ecosystem where multiple narratives compete, but all of them share one thing in common. They make definitive proof impossible. Let me give you the numbers that nobody talks about. In January 2020, Chinese state media published 2,347 pieces about COVID's origins. I'm using the exact figure from media monitoring databases. Of those, 847 suggested the Wuhan market as the source. But here's what matters: 623 simultaneously mentioned international origins or multiple potential sources. They weren't saying it came from the market. They were saying it might have come from the market or many other places. This is narrative injection at scale. You create plausible deniability before anyone even asks for it. But the network goes far deeper than state media. When the WHO investigation team arrived in Wuhan in January 2021, note this: 14 months after the outbreak, they weren't walking into an evidence-gathering mission. They were walking into a stage that had been set with meticulous precision. A former WHO consultant told me something revealing. The Chinese handlers didn't restrict our movement as much as we expected. They didn't need to. Everywhere we went, every person we interviewed, every document we saw, it had already been filtered through a preparation process. The team visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology for just 3 hours and 45 minutes. They didn't inspect lab records. They attended a presentation. Here's what nobody tells you about that investigation. The terms of reference, the actual legal document governing what the WHO could investigate, was co-written by Chinese officials. This isn't speculation. It's in the publicly available agreement signed in July 2020. Specific language prevented investigators from conducting unannounced inspections or unsupervised interviews. Think about what this means. Imagine investigating a potential crime scene where the suspect gets to approve your questions in advance, choose which rooms you can enter, and ensure every witness you interview has been briefed. That's not an investigation, that's theater. But the narrative injection network doesn't stop at controlling physical investigations. This is where it gets really sophisticated. China has systematically cultivated relationships with key institutional players, not through bribery or coercion, but through something far more subtle: dependency. Stay with me because this connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute how this affects every major international institution you think is independent. The WHO's annual budget is approximately $2.4 billion. China's contribution has increased 52% since 2014. But here's what matters more than the money. China hosts 17 WHO collaborating centers. These are institutions that conduct research and provide technical expertise that shapes WHO policy. Only the United States has more, with 29. This isn't about buying influence. It's about becoming structurally essential to how these institutions function. When the WHO needs expertise on emerging infectious diseases in Asia, they turn to institutions that operate under Chinese regulatory authority. Not because they're compromised, but because that's where the infrastructure is. Let me show you how this played out in real time. In February 2020, WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus praised China's response as setting a new standard for outbreak control. At that exact moment, Chinese authorities were still denying sustained human-to-human transmission had occurred in December, contradicting their own internal documents that surfaced later. Was Tedros lying? I don't think so. Here's my opinion. He was operating with the information that his own institution's China-based collaborating centers were providing, and those centers were operating under the exact same pre-approval publication protocols I mentioned earlier. The genius of the narrative injection network is this: you don't need to convince everyone of a lie. You just need to make the truth sufficiently uncertain that institutions default to caution, diplomacy, and further study needed. And we still haven't touched the third system, the one that ensures even if evidence emerged today, it would face insurmountable barriers to acceptance. This is the layer most people don't even know exists. The third system is what separates China's approach from anything we've seen before, and it's the reason that even bombshell evidence would struggle to gain traction today. I call it the institutional capture framework. And it operates on a principle that most Western analysts fundamentally misunderstand. China doesn't need to control institutions. They just need to make those institutions need China. Here's what most people think institutional capture looks like: bribes, threats, political pressure. That's crude and traceable. What China has built is far more elegant. They've made themselves so deeply embedded in the global scientific, economic, and diplomatic infrastructure that challenging them comes with costs nobody wants to pay. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates this perfectly. In September 2021, a group of 18 scientists published a letter in Science magazine calling for a deeper investigation into the lab leak hypothesis. Sounds like scientific debate, right? Here's what happened next that nobody reported. Within 6 weeks, 3 of those scientists had their joint research projects with Chinese institutions quietly suspended, not cancelled, not formally ended, just put on indefinite hold. One of those scientists spoke to me on condition of anonymity. He said, "I lost access to the world's largest database of bat coronavirus samples. My graduate students lost research opportunities. My university's administration didn't say anything directly, but the message was clear. This complicates things. This is how the institutional capture framework works. No direct retaliation, no public confrontation, just the quiet withdrawal of access, collaboration, and opportunity." And here's the critical part. It works because China has spent 20 years making that access genuinely valuable. The numbers tell the story. In 2003, China produced 49,788 scientific research papers. In 2022, that number was 738,527, an increase of 1,384%. But volume isn't the key metric. Here's what matters. China now controls access to research infrastructure that doesn't exist anywhere else at the same scale. They have the world's largest biobank, the most extensive genomic databases for Asian populations, and research facilities that would cost tens of billions to replicate elsewhere. If you're a virologist studying coronavirus evolution, you need Chinese data. If you're researching emerging infectious diseases, you need access to Chinese field sites. If you're a university administrator, you need those partnership agreements because your competitors have them. Here's the part that should terrify you. This creates a system where self-censorship becomes rational. Scientists don't avoid politically sensitive conclusions because they're being overtly pressured. They do it because they're making calculated career decisions. And institutions don't push for uncomfortable investigations because they're weighing diplomatic relationships against uncertain outcomes. Let me show you what this actually means in practice. When the WHO proposed a second phase investigation in July 2021 that would include audits of laboratories in Wuhan, China, didn't just refuse. They released a counter-proposal, a global investigation into COVID origins that would include labs in the United States, specifically Fort Detrick. Now, you might think this was deflection, and partially it was, but here's what's more interesting. The proposal immediately split the international scientific community. Some researchers said, actually, that's fair, transparency should be universal. Others recognized it as a delay tactic. But here's my opinion. It didn't matter which group was right, because the debate itself achieved China's objective. It transformed a specific question about Wuhan into an abstract argument about global governance. This is the institutional capture framework at its most effective. You don't win the argument, you change what the argument is about. And here's the doubt I keep coming back to. Even if definitive evidence exists, say, a database showing gain-of-function experiments that perfectly explain COVID's unique characteristics, could it actually change anything at this point? The institutions that would need to validate that evidence, investigate it, and act on it are all embedded in the exact system I'm describing. A senior economist told me something that stuck with me. We've built a global system where China is too important to hold accountable. Not because they're too powerful to challenge, but because the cost of challenging them is distributed across thousands of institutions that would each have to sacrifice something real. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because what comes next pulls all of this together into a framework that explains not just COVID, but China's entire strategic approach to global power. Let me pull this together, because what we're really looking at here isn't just about a virus origin story. It's about something far bigger. China has pioneered what I call strategic unaccountability, a system where they can operate without consequences, not through strength, but through structural design. Think about what we've covered. The opacity machine ensures that evidence becomes irretrievable or contradictory. The narrative injection network floods the information space so that certainty becomes impossible. And the institutional capture framework makes the institutions that could demand accountability dependent on maintaining the relationship. Together, these three systems create something unprecedented, a scenario where truth becomes functionally irrelevant. Here's my prediction, and this is what keeps me up at night. We will never have definitive proof of COVID's origins. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the systems China has built make definitive proof impossible to obtain, validate, and act upon. And here's the really uncomfortable part. This might not even require a conspiracy. It could simply be the natural outcome of how China has structured its relationship with the world. Let me ask you a question. Does it actually matter at this point whether COVID came from a lab or a market? Stay with me here, because I'm not saying the truth doesn't matter morally or scientifically. I'm saying that strategically, China has already won this game. They've demonstrated that they can have a crisis emerge from their territory, control the investigation, shape the narrative, and maintain their position in the global system without meaningful consequences. The real lesson of COVID isn't about bats or beakers. It's about power operating through dependency rather than dominance. China doesn't need aircraft carriers circling every continent when they've made themselves essential to scientific research, manufacturing, supply chains, and international institutions. That's a far more durable form of power. So what happens next? I see three possible scenarios playing out over the next decade. Scenario 1, strategic acceptance. The world quietly moves on. COVID origins become like so many other unresolved questions. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the true extent of Chernobyl's impact, what really happened in Tiananmen Square, not forgotten but filed away as unknowable. China faces no structural consequences, and the systems I've described become templates for managing future crises. Probability 60%. Scenario 2, slow decoupling. Western institutions gradually reduce dependency on Chinese research infrastructure and data access, not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient rebuilding of alternative systems. This takes 15 to 20 years and costs hundreds of billions in duplicated infrastructure. China's strategic unaccountability loses effectiveness, but only slowly. Probability 30%. Scenario 3, evidence emerges that's too big to ignore. A whistleblower releases laboratory records, genomic data surfaces that definitively proves engineering or internal documents leak at sufficient scale. But here's my doubt, even in this scenario, does it create accountability or just another round of the same institutional paralysis we've already seen? Probability 10%. Here's what I think actually happens, some combination of scenarios 1 and 2. The world doesn't forget about COVID origins, but it doesn't get answers either. And meanwhile, China continues refining these systems, the Opacity Machine, the narrative injection network, the institutional capture framework, because they've proven they work. If I'm right, then COVID wasn't just a pandemic, it was a demonstration project. China showed the world, and more importantly, showed themselves, that they've built a form of power that doesn't require winning arguments or controlling narratives completely. It just requires making accountability too costly, too complicated, and too uncertain for the international system to pursue. The question we should be asking isn't where did COVID come from? The question is, what does it mean that we've built a world where that question might be permanently unanswerable? And what does China do next with that knowledge? If this analysis changed how you see the COVID origin debate, or if you think I'm completely wrong, I want to hear from you in the comments. Specifically, tell me this. Do you think definitive proof of COVID's origins would actually change anything at this point, or have we moved past the point where evidence matters? And if you want to understand how these same systems apply to Taiwan, technology transfer, and the next phase of US-China competition, subscribe, because that's exactly what we're covering next. The game has changed. Most people just haven't realized it yet.